And you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about the latest in the U.S.-China trade war, we have with us CSIS's Scott Kennedy, a senior advisor here at CSIS and our trustee chair in China Business and Economics. Scott, welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be with you, Andrew.
Scott, so we want to talk about the trade war, but first, I want to ask you, what is the economic picture in China right now?
Well, I'm happy to discuss all of this with you. And, for the past few years, China's economy has been growing extremely slowly. As most people know, the pandemic was not good to China, at least the last year of it in 2022, where following the Shanghai lockdowns in other cities, the country's economy really froze up. There were global supply chain challenges. Folks probably remember auto chips and all of these other things that were affecting the world, including China. In 2023, people thought there'd be a bounce back. There was not, nor was there in 2024. The Chinese government has thrown a ton of money at industry, advanced manufacturing. Their production has exploded, but demand in China, a lot of that has been exported abroad. Hence, China had a $1 trillion trade surplus last year. So last year, China clocked in officially at 5%. It was probably south of that, but, slower than it's been in a long time. This year, I was just in China for a couple weeks, and it feels like the economy has roughly stabilized. They have rolled out the beginnings of a stimulus. You've seen some shoots of growth, more consumption, a little bit more growth in private investment. The Liberation Day was certainly a huge shock to the Chinese system. Political, economic. So far, we haven't seen real signs that this has been shock and awe that's really pushed China's economy to the edge. I think actually things seem relatively stable there. Remember, China has a relatively small financial market, closed capital accounts, so there can't be, capital rushing out if there's problems. They control their exchange rate. So at the moment, China's economy looks like it's relatively steady and some signs of positive growth, but the headwinds from the trade war will probably get bigger.
And with the current tariffs as they stand, what kind of pain does this inflict upon the Chinese people and thus on the Chinese government?
I think, China's dependence on products from the U.S. and to export to the U.S. has gone down. About 5 years ago, at its peak, the U.S. was about 20% of Chinese exports. Now it's down to about 14%. Same shift on the other side. They depend even less on American imports. And so there are a slate of Chinese companies that are reeling right now that if this goes on very long, they won't have customers. Some Chinese have invested in Vietnam and India as a way to get around direct American tariffs and move supply chains with other multinationals. Vietnam and India aren't as good locales to produce. They don't have the logistics and infrastructure that China has. And so that's not been great for them. And as you see, the US has tariffs on those countries as well, not as high as on China. So that strategy is a challenge. We did see the Trump administration back away a little bit over the last few days, lowering tariffs on electronics products, phones, down to about 25% instead of the 145% level. That's still a lot. So this is not good for China's economy, especially for public confidence. But they do have staying power. And this is something that I don't see them backing down.
I want to ask you about their Southeast Asia strategy in a minute, but sticking with this, how much pain can the Chinese actually tolerate?
I actually think they are in a much better position now than they were during the first Trump administration. Yes, cyclically, the economy has slowed down. Some of these structural problems that they have with demography and debt look more imposing. But China's got a whole variety of ways that they can weather this major storm. Technologically, they are way more capable than they were 6 to 7 years ago. I visited several companies on my last trip, and I do when I go for each of my trips. And they are genuinely impressive world beaters, some of these firms. Even visited a company that is facing export controls from the United States. And when I went there over a year ago, they were really in bad shape. They did not know how to adjust with not having access to this technology. When I just talked to them recently, they've overcome those problems and the quality and efficiency of their production has increased. And this is not just them saying it, others have noticed that as well. So the Chinese tech-wise still dependent on the US and West, but not as much as they used to be. China has a huge pile of savings, and both households in the bank as well as the government, they still have a lot of fiscal bullets they can shoot to stimulate growth. One of the good things about China that you wouldn't have thought is positive is that they have relatively undeveloped financial markets, which account for only about 60% of China's GDP. American financial markets are about 140% of US GDP. So when our markets go down, we all suffer big time. When Chinese markets go down, it's not as big a problem for them. They also have a closed capital account, as I said. Finally, China's much more protectionist than the United States. So it can go around the world offering goodies to folks in Southeast Asia, Europe, elsewhere, to get them to not side with the US in this fight. That's harder for the US. The US can basically say, we won't impose those tariffs on you. So I think the Chinese have I guess the last thing I should say, Andrew, which I think may be most important, is that for the Chinese leadership, this was originally a trade spat. It's now an existential conflict. For them, they must come out doing well because this is about the leadership of the party and overall direction of China. So I think they would be willing to take this, as they say, to the end, if absolutely necessary. And so they are a very difficult, challenging opponent for the Trump administration.
So, Scott, if I understand this right, what you're saying is it's an existential crisis to their leadership, because if they're the ones that blink, they're the ones that back down, they become weak to their people, but they also become weaker on the international stage. Do I understand that correctly?
I think that's exactly right, Andrew, that this is a monster challenge for them. Xi Jinping cannot come out of this a loser. It'll be bad for China. It will be hugely bad for him as well. This is the issue now on which his governance is going to be judged.
Scott, I want to ask you, what is their overarching strategy economically during this period of instability?
China's strategy to deal with the current circumstances isn't a radical departure from what they've been trying to do under Xi Jinping's leadership and even before, which is move up the global value added chain in advanced technologies, be less dependent on others for those technologies, translate those technologies to have positive spillovers in other parts of their economy. For them, AI is not just AI. It's applied to the medical sector, to automobiles, to manufacturing processes. It's not just ChatGPT or DeepSeek or something like that. That's been with them for a long time. They've also been trying to reduce the significance of real estate and infrastructure in their economy as well, so that they can get to a higher level of development. So I don't think that those things change. I do think what is different for them now is they've got to get through this without a mega economic crisis. And two, they have to accelerate their decline in dependence on foreign markets and increase their reliance on domestic demand and consumer demand, which is something they've not wanted to do, because to do that means a shift in the political economy of who has power in China, from state-owned enterprises and producers to households. So you have to raise their wages, provide them a much broader safety net, address their concerns about housing and all of those things. And that's something that China has been very hesitant to do. But the pressure from the United States, and that they're going to be facing from others who don't want to be the targets of unloaded Chinese products, who are already anxious about that, it might accelerate that. So in some odd way, what the Trump administration is doing might actually push the Chinese to do things which they should have been doing for the last decade.
Okay, so where does this all go next between China and the US?
Well, I think right now, odd enough to say, we are in, I don't like to use this word these days, but in a stable moment.
Really?
Because what we're seeing now is, the big pieces have already been put in place in terms of tariffs, in terms of Chinese restrictions on rare earths, other things. We're going to see little pieces moved. The Chinese just shut off imports of some American movies. There's a report that they're going to stop taking deliveries of new Boeing aircraft. the US may respond and put export controls on technologies that go into China's own commercial aircraft, the C919. So we may see individual pieces like that. But I'm not sure we're going to see a mega escalation of this crisis right now. If we do, it's going to be in the financial sector. It's going to be the US going after Chinese banks, Chinese companies listed in New York, perhaps swift sanctions against Chinese institutions if they wanted to go nuclear. The Chinese could do a parallel kind of things. Pushing those big buttons have major blowback. And so the consequences we saw last week on the American stock market and bond market would be even bigger if either side pushes those buttons. So I think they may hold off on those things. I think right now, both Beijing and Washington are focused on negotiating with everybody else, the fight for the middle, to see if they can outflank the other. And then I think they are beginning to think about what would a negotiation with the other side look like? Who would it be? What would the topics be on the table? That's still down the road. But I think that as they are thinking about potential escalation and negotiating with others, they also have in mind how they are positioned vis-a-vis the other side.
And Scott, we talk a lot about decoupling. First, I want to ask you, what does decoupling actually mean? Second, I want to ask you, are we decoupling with China?
So from a physical perspective, if the US and Chinese economies decouple, we become far less a range of measures. That means we would have much less direct trade with each other, direct investment with our companies producing in each other's markets, finance, so portfolio investment, corporate bonds, etc. We'd have much less travel of tourists and students. We would basically come apart. It doesn't necessarily mean that we would be isolated globally, because we might be still connected to many other economies or them, but our direct connections would basically be eliminated in a decoupled context. We're not there yet by any stretch of the imagination. Last year, $650 billion in trade in goods and services, if not more. We have 286 Chinese companies listed in New York with a market cap of 1.1 trillion. The Chinese directly hold 760 billion in US treasuries and 600 more through other parties. We have thousands of American companies on the ground producing in China. Last year, sold about 500 billion worth of goods. We have 1,000 plus Chinese companies in the US selling about 80 billion worth of product and services in the United States. So we are still deeply connected, but we can see decoupling from here. It used to be way off in the horizon, but now you can imagine it, because with 125 to 150% tariffs, that's going to make just about every good uncompetitive. Throw on the export controls, and then potential financial restrictions that both sides might be contemplating. And then, of course, for travelers, the number of Americans traveling to China now is definitely going to fall, not because of expensive plane tickets, but because of nerves of what it means to go there. And the same for Chinese potentially thinking about coming to the United States. So certain elements of the relationship are definitely going to be restricted in the direction of decoupling. Both sides would have to do a lot more to really actually pull the relationship entirely apart.
And Scott, for us in the United States, we're pursuing strategies so we can go it alone without China. The Trump administration's starting to articulate a lot of those. But what about China? What are they doing? Xi Jinping's currently on a trip to Southeast Asia. Is that part of what he's trying to do?
So I think the Chinese have been de-risking, to use a Biden administration term, for quite some time. In fact, the word decoupling originally was something that they thought of in the 1990s when they began to become more economically connected with us. They're worried about dependence on the dollar, American technology, and they thought, well, do we need to decouple from these elements of the West because of our security differences? So they started the de-risking long before we even thought of that idea. And so they're, again, continuing this long-term plan of technology self-reliance in information technologies, robotics, in automobiles, medical, pharmaceuticals, de-Americanizing. They still are going to rely on lots of things from the rest of the world, but they're trying to radically reduce their dependence on the United States in particular. And at the same time, they are going out to the rest of the world selling, being close to China, doing business with China. Chinese leader Xi Jinping was in Vietnam yesterday, met with the Vietnamese leadership. They signed 45 deals in a day.
45.
45. He's now today in Malaysia. He's going to Cambodia. Other Chinese officials are going to be talking to the Japanese, the South Koreans, Australians, the Europeans, Latin Americans. They are in deal-making mode with everybody. Now, some of these are very small individual deals. Some of them aren't about business. They're about other issues. But China wants to build the pile. You remember when academics, when you got your job is to make that publishing pile as high as possible to impress the hell out of everybody. That's what the Chinese are doing right now. They are trying to make it look like they are cleaning up around the globe, even as the relationship with the US is foundering. So they have accelerated their diplomacy to avoid being isolated. Because the biggest thing that they fear is not that the US and Japan will figure out how to reduce tariffs and restrictions on each other, but that part of the deal will be Japan limit its trade with China, limit its investment in China. And the same with everybody else around the world, that the US builds some common wall. Now, given how much the US has offended everybody, I think the Chinese might think this is going to be hard for the US to do. But if the Trump administration is really smart and they play their cards right as best they can, then the Chinese have something to worry about.
Scott, with all the talk about decoupling, de-risking, us walking away from each other, the United States walking away from China, China walking away from us, what does it do to major national security issues between the two countries?
Well, I think the conventional wisdom that has, solidified in the last 5 to 8 years is that our economic interdependence with China creates real huge risks, and that we have to limit that connectivity because of the economic security challenges that arise, technology leakage, supply chain dependence, vulnerabilities for critical infrastructure, Chinese economic coercion. And we've got to pull all that back, and we've got to align more with others. We have to build at home. The Biden administration's, invest, align, compete. And we see that we're continuing to move in many of those same directions, even with the reductions in the CHIPS Act spending and things like that. I do think that there's a significant risk, though, on the national security side by really pulling these two economies apart. It really would eliminate many of the areas where we do have common commercial interests. It would make it much harder to find common ground to tackle climate change, to tackle general AI and what it means for our economies and societies and national security, to deal with potential future pandemics, and makes it more likely that hotspots, which have been, sort of bubbling, become much, much more dangerous. And the most important of those is in the Taiwan Strait. So if we are not interacting with each other, if we are not communicating with each other, and it's simply one side against the other, as tough as they possibly can be, a la the Cold War, that may feel like we're protected in one way, but in the other way, our risks go up dramatically.
Dr. Scott Kennedy, as always, thank you very much. Really appreciate your insight and your expertise.
Great talking to you, Andrew. Thanks so much.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.
I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. Today on Truth of the Matter, we're going to talk about the impact of President Trump's tariffs on cars. And we have with us someone who is really an expert in this. It's Dr. Monica Gorman, who was Special Assistant to President Biden for Manufacturing and Industrial Policy, as well as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Manufacturing. Monica is now Managing Director at Crowell Global Advisors, where she advises clients on global trade, supply chain resilience, and industrial policy. Monica, welcome to the podcast. We've got a lot to talk about when it comes to autos and tariffs. This week has been just whiplash. The word uncertainty is constantly thrown around. The Wall Street Journal even pointed out that the auto industry is a case in point. Can you tell us why you think that might be a case in point?
Well, Andrew, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the president's Liberation Day really shakes the foundation of the current system in the auto industry. The good news is that there's been a temporary reprieve. The USMCA qualifying goods continue to be exempt from the president's tariffs. That is really, really important, especially for the Detroit Three, but also some foreign automakers who produce in the US. But if these tariffs stay on for any length of time, it is not an overstatement to say this could lead to a fundamental reordering of the US market.
So as it stands, the tariffs were exempt from President Trump's reciprocal tariffs, which he's now put on 90-day pause. But they are covered by his 25% tariffs on cars and trucks. And the Anderson Economic Group estimated last week that the auto tariffs alone would increase the cost for smaller cars like Honda Civics and Volkswagen Jettas from $2,500 to $4,500. Larger vehicles like SUVs, Chevy Suburban, GMC Yukon, Cadillac Escalade could rise by $10,000 to $12,000. You know, this is a difficult environment for consumers as it is. What do you think the impact of rising costs like that on cars will be on the United States?
I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. One of the biggest impacts we see is that these tariffs will apply disproportionately to smaller vehicles and lower priced vehicles. I think one of the stats I saw was that the 25% will apply to nearly 80% of vehicles priced under $30,000 right now. And we know the smaller vehicles, including those compact SUVs, are particularly exposed. And so in the near term, it's going to lead to higher prices and potentially also less choice. We've seen some automakers, foreign automakers, already pausing shipments to the US market. That means there's going to be fewer vehicle choices for American consumers, and those prices are going to go up as well.
So what happens if you're buying a used car? Do used car prices go up as well?
Typically, yes. There's going to be a bit of a delay, but clearly, if just think of typical supply and demand, if prices go up for new vehicles, folks may look for used vehicles instead. That's going to drive up demand for the used vehicle market, and we will see prices go up there too.
And all of this feels incredibly destabilizing. What would need to happen now, that the genie's out of the bottle to really stabilize here?
So I think the headline there is just the need for more certainty. This is in many ways a crisis, but crisis always presents opportunity as well. And the president has tapped into a deep undercurrent in the United States, a deep desire for more U.S. manufacturing. We've seen sort of the strength of the North American supply chain, and there is real potential here for more investment in the United States, particularly in the auto industry. This also is likely to lead to renegotiation, particularly with Europe and their auto tariffs, and that's important, as well as Japan and Korea, to provide more access for American automakers. So there's some real opportunity here. But if we're really looking to drive investment in the United States, there has to be some level of certainty of what the trading environment is going to look like, what the investment environment is going to look like, so that automakers and other just companies up and down the supply chain are really certain that they can invest in this environment over the long term. They're only going to expand if they think the long-term ROI is there.
Sure, but in the meantime, former Ford CEO James Hackett estimated that the tariffs had reduced its annual profit by $1 billion. How can our big three car companies sustain that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a huge challenge here, and it's maybe somewhat counterintuitive, but I think it was a report this week from JATO Dynamics that said the Detroit Three are actually the most exposed at the moment. They sell the highest percentage of their cars that are imports into the United States. It's the highest percentage of global sales relative to foreign rivals. So we know the Detroit Three are actually quite exposed here, and that is going to be weighing on their ability to invest. The other factor, of course, is going to be the American consumer. If we see higher prices, we see consumers start to pull back and buy fewer vehicles, that's also going to be less revenue coming in, and then less revenue that can be invested in the United States.
Another stat that jumped out at me from the Anderson Economic Group study was that investors and employees of manufacturers, suppliers, and dealers in the auto industry will absorb at least another $30 billion in tariff costs. That's a huge number.
It is a huge number, and it has to come from somewhere. So there will be trade-offs for business and as well as for consumers, and that is going to weigh on the economy. It's going to weigh on this industry's ability to continue to expand, to invest, and to compete with foreign automakers.
Before we talk about the foreign manufacturers and U.S. consumers long term, I want to go back to the point you made about how this could be good in the long term. With all of this uncertainty, you pointed to the fact that in the long term, this could be good for U.S. manufacturing, and that's certainly what President Trump and his advisors are saying. How do we get there with this plan and these tactics?
So execution is going to be key. I do credit President Trump going back to his first administration for really reorienting the conversation politically and just generally in mainstream and in trade circles around the need to focus on U.S. manufacturing and the need to really think about the global trading environment. And we actually saw that carried through, including with the Biden administration, and sort of a focus once again, on industrial policy. It's actually not a new concept. It's a very old concept going back to Alexander Hamilton. But we've seen that thread really since the first Trump administration. What we're seeing here now is just a difference in tactics, particularly with these broad tariffs. And that does create a lot of uncertainty in terms of the ability to execute. But that renewed focus is not going to go away. And I do think that's good. It's really emphasizing how do we ensure that, particularly for critical industries that employ a lot of Americans as well, how do we make sure that these are vibrant industries? I'm a firm believer that supply chains need to be strong, need to be resilient. That is one of the aspects of the North American supply chains that is really, I think, one of our best assets. And continuing to invest in North America, with the U.S. being a strong engine, but not the only engine, working with our Mexican and Canadian trading partners. So there's real opportunity, I think, to make this region incredibly vibrant in auto manufacturing. The other opportunity here is that perhaps they don't like the tactics, but our trading partners in Europe and Japan and Korea know that auto tariffs are on the table. And the reality is that U.S. auto manufacturers have not had the same level of access to sell in those markets that those auto manufacturers have had in the United States. And so this does present an opportunity to expand market access for American automakers. But again, so much is going to be in the execution here. We don't want to blow up our trading relationships. It is important to remember these are our allies and partners. And so negotiating in a way that gets everybody to the table and expands that access, but ensures that we're still really preserving those relationships as well.
Now, Monica, like you, I live in the DC area, and every other car in this area is some kind of an import. There's lots of American cars here, but there's a lot of imports. What do the tariffs do? How do they threaten foreign manufacturers, in the long term?
Well, I mean, certainly prices are going to go up, and foreign manufacturers are going to have to grapple with what that means. I think it remains to be seen how much of that gets passed along to the consumer, how much foreign auto manufacturers choose to eat and just have it cut into their profits, where they may squeeze some of their suppliers to take on some of those costs. That is going to be probably bespoke to every particular manufacturer. I do think it goes back to consumer choice. As foreign auto manufacturers look at their mix of options in the US market, they are likely to cull those. There will be fewer options just to ensure that their profitability is sustainable for those that they do sell. But again, I do think we're going to see less choice along with those higher prices.
Right, because, I don't care who you are. If you're buying a $70,000 Audi, you don't want to pay $20,000 more for that Audi. Like, that just doesn't sound right at all, and most people won't do it.
I think that's right. Yeah, that's a lot of money.
So what about Canada? And what course of action are Canada and the EU taking to preserve their economic interests in the auto industry?
Well, it's an interesting question because I think they're taking slightly different paths. Starting first with the EU, we know the EU has traditionally protected its auto industry, but they've also signaled that those tariffs are now on the table. And so that does present an opportunity in these negotiations. I think the EU has been sort of keeping its powder dry with respect to retaliatory tariffs, trying to focus on options for negotiations. And it's a very tenuous time, but I think there is significant opportunity if these negotiations are handled in a sort of deft and nuanced way. Staying with the EU for a second, The EU also is facing an onslaught of vehicles from China. Cannot emphasize that enough. BYD has made major inroads just in the last couple of years into the European auto market. And that is a significant threat to European automakers. So as they think about what this means in terms of US trading relations, the role of Chinese automakers in the EU has to be on their minds as well. And it's going to be interesting to see if the EU starts to grapple with that threat from China at the same time that it thinks about opening up its market more to US auto manufacturers. Now for Canada, it's interesting. Canada clearly has been extremely frustrated with a lot of the rhetoric coming out from Washington. Just thinking about foreign policy here for a second, the new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, went first to London and Paris. Those were his first overseas trips. That was unheard of prior to the time that we are in, and I think really highlights the depth of Canada's frustration, even anger with the US at the moment. So they have responded with auto tariffs, but with a few interesting exceptions. So they also are allowing USMCA compliant vehicles to continue to come in, but my understanding is notably if those vehicles are assembled in the United States, they are exempting Mexican content and Canadian content, but not US content. And I think that really highlights the depth of Canada's frustration right now with the United States. But Canada also knows that the integration of our supply chains across North America has been years in the development. That is not going to change overnight. And truly, we are all stronger when we hang together. So there does appear to be a desire from Canada to lean into that integration of our supply chains, and we will see if that continues. Canada did have an exception in their retaliatory tariffs in that they are exempting auto parts. I think that is incredibly important. Tariffs on auto parts are going to drive up the cost of repairs across the board. Canada knows that, and I think has exempted it. We've not seen that in the United States, and so that's another aspect potentially affecting this industry, certainly in the US with the US tariffs.
Right. So that means that if you decided, as I did a couple months ago, to buy out my lease of my car so I didn't have to deal with any of this stuff going forward, I'm still not in the clear because if the car breaks down and they need to replace parts, those parts are going to cost a lot more.
Exactly. And if you use aftermarket parts, particularly if those are coming from China, those costs just went way up.
Let's talk a little bit more about China. I was just in Europe and I took my first Uber ride in a Chinese SUV, Chinese-made electric SUV. Absolutely incredible car. I would be worried if those cars were sold in the United States because they're cheaper, they're really nice, and they certainly would rival Tesla or any other electric car manufacturer. I sort of got the feeling like if the Chinese were allowed into our market, if they're continued to be allowed into the European market and other markets, they're really going to eat our lunch. So aren't these tariffs probably a protective thing for us in that sense?
Well, we already had high tariffs on Chinese auto imports. Those have been in place for a while now. And to your point, with good reason. The Europeans do not have high tariffs, and we have seen, again, huge gains, particularly by BYD in the European auto market. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It's because these are really good cars. We're not talking cheap, low value. We're talking...
No, they're really good.
Yeah. Inexpensive, but extremely high value for your money, and consumers like them. Now, there are a lot of challenges and concerns associated with those vehicles. These are connected vehicles. You can have non-electric connected vehicles as well. We can get into that. But connected electric vehicles from China, these are essentially computers on wheels. And remember, ultimately, where BYD is, and ultimately, as a manufacturer, who BYD answers to, it's the Chinese government. So all the data being collected by these cars, BYD cars, ultimately is in China. That presents some significant security concerns for the United States. And that is why you've also seen action in the United States under the ICTS authorities at Commerce, particularly for connected vehicles that may have roots in more adversarial nations. So that is another reason why we're unlikely to see BYD cars on US roads anytime soon. But from a pure competitiveness and from sort of quality of vehicle, there's a lot to learn from what BYD has done.
It's incredible. You know, on my other podcast, The Trade Guys, with Bill Reinsch and Scott Miller, and now Phil Luck, I was always asking them this question. Why would, it's hard to imagine American consumers driving Chinese cars. There's got to be a big stigma around that. And what they also would say is that, well, there used to be a big stigma around driving Japanese cars too. And there was a stigma around driving Korean cars too. And now, of course, those are all over the road because they make really good cars and they're cheap. So it would be no different with China, I guess.
I think that's right. Ultimately, consumers are going to choose, and that's the beauty of a free market, consumers are going to choose the best value for money. And the reality is the Chinese are making really beautiful cars now.
Absolutely.
But again, there are real security concerns with vehicles today in a way that we did not see in the 80s and 90s, because vehicles are computers on wheels.
This would be like the same as letting Huawei into the United States market in a big way, correct?
That's a great analogy, yes.
Okay, so with all these tariffs, are they expected to generate significant revenue? And if so, where's that revenue going to go?
Well, the president has said so, yes. And I do think when we look at just the rollout that happened on April 2nd, there was the 10% tariff across the board, and then there were additional reciprocal tariffs that came into effect later and were ultimately paused by the president. That says something. Just thinking as a former policymaker, somebody who worked on these types of decisions and rollouts, the fact that those were staggered suggests that they may have different purposes. So the 10% tariff, which remains in place, that appears to be more focused on revenue. The president has been very clear that revenue is one of his goals and that it is in place. Treasury will begin collecting that soon. That goes into a general revenue fund. The other tariffs may be more oriented towards some of the other policy goals stated by the president, including U.S. manufacturing and rebalancing trade to be more fair. With respect to the revenue, though, it's kind of an interesting dilemma to watch. It goes into Treasury's general fund, but we also know that tariffs have impacts. 10% across the board is almost certainly likely to create inflationary pressures in the U.S. So we don't know what that's going to do to consumer spending and ultimately, thereby the amount of revenue that's ultimately collected. We also know that particularly given where things are with China, the high tariff rate that is now on Chinese products and the retaliation from China, that's essentially closed off the export market for U.S. farmers to China, and it's a significant export market. So U.S. farmers could be hurt significantly. We saw this in the first Trump administration, where China retaliated and U.S. farmers were not able to export as much to the Chinese market. And in the first Trump administration, the subsidies were given to U.S. farmers to keep them afloat. If we see that again, that's going to eat into this revenue that's coming into Treasury's general fund. So it's not as easy as saying, oh, we got a lot of money coming in, we can spend it elsewhere, because we know there's going to be other parts of the U.S. economy that are hit. And so that money may have to be diverted to offset some of the harm that happens from the retaliatory measures.
You know, Monica, one of the things that trade experts always say is that it's very hard to flip the switch on and then flip it off again, because so many things need to be undone and redone. But it's exactly the case right now that President Trump seems to be whiplashing back and forth between different ideas, different plans, pauses, etc. What kind of impact do you think that this kind of, scattered policy is going to have in the short term and then in the long term as well?
Well, it's almost a cliche now to talk about how business hates uncertainty, but I spent 18 years in business, and it is absolutely true. And it's because business can't turn on a dime, and supply chains are built up over the course of several years. Even in industries like apparel, where I spent a lot of time, it's relatively easy, certainly relative to, say, the auto industry or the semiconductor industry, to set up a garment manufacturing facility. But it still takes time, and you still need all the inputs that go with that, the fabrics and the threads and all the other things. So you need the upstream supply chains. If you're talking about autos, it's many years of investment for every single aspect of the supply chain. And business doesn't do that. I mean, there's years that go into assessing where to put those plants, what types of investments to make, how to configure them, which styles they're going to make. That's just not something that can happen overnight. And in a time like this with so much uncertainty, I think you're likely to see more paralysis than anything. Folks sitting on the sidelines waiting to see what's going to happen. Because if you're going to make those kinds of investments, you need to know that there's a return over the period of several years. And there's just too much uncertainty right now to know that.
Monica, tariffs played a large role in the 1929 depression. How can U.S. manufacturers and consumers work to avoid something like this happening again?
I mean, first, let's learn from history. We have the benefit of being able to look back in history and see these impacts. Smoot and Hawley did not have that benefit when the tariffs were put on in 1930. So that's one. Let's learn from history. Two, I think we have to stay grounded in the reality of today's economy and particularly the current configuration of our supply chains. And that's where I think the role of business and companies right now is really important. It's important to show the administration, to help the administration understand how manufacturing works in 2025. And even if you invest in one factory here in the United States, where are all those inputs coming from? Where are all the materials coming from? What is the supply chain that new facility would depend on? And how many years does it take to bring that supply chain back? And it's not to say that we don't need some reordering of our supply chains. We certainly saw during COVID what happens when we are overly dependent on a particular country or just a couple of suppliers for any particular product. There is a need for more resilience and some reordering of the supply chains, but it's going to need to happen in a careful, thoughtful, measured, strategic fashion over a period of a number of years. And so I think really a voice that's been missing so far in the debate, particularly in terms of the policy decisions being made, is the voice of business and the voice of companies. So for auto tariffs, the president used under Section 232, but he used a report that was done in his first administration. A lot has happened since then, and there's really a need for industry to provide up-to-date input in terms of how industry's been hit, what happened during COVID, and sort of what reordering would look like. That really should be informing where we're going. So I hope that there will be an opportunity for more industry voices here to really help to shape where this goes from here.
Dr. Monica Gorman, really appreciate your insight today. Fascinating discussion. Thanks so much. I hope you come back soon.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Great to be here.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.
Graceland, the Trump administration has said repeatedly that the American people are going to have to accept a little bit of a pain for long-term gain. But it seems like this puts us into a lot of pain. Can you put that in perspective?
It's going to be a lot of pain, and it's going to be long-term pain. So here's what I mean by long-term pain is as these policies and as these restrictions are coming out, most mining companies are finding new off-takers. They're not interested in the on and off restrictions, the on and off tariff, because ultimately they have shareholder returns that they owe, and they need the stability we're not able to give them. An easy example of this, earlier we talked about germanium, which goes into semiconductors. Our biggest source of germanium comes from a company called Teck, which is a Canadian company. They mine it in Alaska, it gets refined in Canada, and then it comes back. But with the tariffs, their CEO has gone public and said, I'm going to send it to Asia. With US tariffs, I'm not interested in the US market. So what that does is China is off the table because they've restricted us. Canada is now not going to be a source. And then what do we have left? Every device that we need a semiconductor for becomes more expensive in the long term because I can't bring another germanium source online quickly. We are creating a long-term distrust in markets that finding off-takers to the US market beyond 6 months or a year is going to get very difficult.
I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about China's rare earth minerals and what it means for the United States in this trade war, we have with us Graceland Bhaskaran, who is the director of our Critical Minerals Security Program at CSIS. Graceland, welcome back. As always, it's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So this popped up pretty quick, and it's all over the news now, but I want to ask you, can we back up before we get to the news about, our military, all these, car manufacturers, all the things that go into these rare earth minerals we get from China? First, I want to ask you, what are these rare earth minerals that we get from China, and why do we need them from China as opposed to developing them here?
Rare earth minerals are actually a group of 17 minerals, and they're a total misnomer because they're not actually rare. They're found everywhere, but they tend to be found in very small quantities. So what we're looking for are deposits in large quantities. And the big difficulty with them is that China actually has a pretty dominant hold. They produce about 60% of the world's rare earths. But our big critical vulnerability is that they process, on average, about 90% of the world's supply, meaning they source rare earths from everywhere. And it's really a problem now for our national security because these rare earths are in almost every form of defense technology, from warships and fighter jets to missiles, satellites, and our radar systems.
And so what impacts is this going to have on our auto industries, our aerospace manufacturers, semiconductor companies, and military contractors?
It's going to be pretty consequential. So the new restrictions, there's a range of restrictions. We generally start with something we call non-automatic licensing, which means that companies have to apply to get a permit to be able to export. Then you have bans and you have quotas, and then you go out, tariffs and quotas, and then you go out to an all-out ban. Now, what these restrictions are they are non-automatic licensing. So companies have to apply to be able to export rare earths now. However, these restrictions actually come hand in hand with a new list of firms that are on essentially a ban list from doing business with China. 15 of these firms are actually defense and aerospace companies, which means that even once the permits start being issued to export rare earths, they won't be able to go to some of these firms that manufacture really critical technologies.
So give me an example when it comes to the military, and then I want to talk about cars. What do we use these what are the exact rare earth minerals we're talking about, and what do we use them for in our military technology?
So in particular, there are a few really critical rare earths. So dysprosium, neodymium, terbium are some of them. Now, when I look at our defense technology, an F-35 fighter jet contains 900 pounds of just rare earth elements. An Arleigh Burke class DDG-51 destroyer is 5,200 pounds, while a Virginia class submarine is about 9,200 pounds.
Well, this is especially important for CSIS because Arleigh Burke was our founder. So we need to keep that ship going.
We absolutely need to keep that ship going. And at a time when there is heightened geopolitical tension, Seth Jones put out a report last year when he noted that China is outpacing us in terms of developing and manufacturing weapons at a rate of 5 to 6x.
Right.
Now you add in the fact that the minerals I need to build those defense technologies are going to be very hard for our American defense companies to get their hands on. And you realize that our ability to respond to threats is deeply inhibited.
That's really interesting. And Seth Jones, the head of our defense and security program, did come out with that pretty groundbreaking report. Sounds like we're going to need an update now. But let's put the military stuff on pause for a second. And let's talk about cars in America and how cars are manufactured and why we need these minerals to keep our cars rolling off the assembly line.
So I'm from Detroit. I love our auto industry. And one of the things that I'm most worried about is that a lot of the minerals that we have been hit with export restrictions are actually in the cars. So rare earths form an incredibly powerful magnet. And that magnet is actually part of the motor that goes into an electric vehicle. So what happens for a lot of these companies, they don't actually have the same stockpiles. Sometimes defense companies, and in particular, we even have a mineral defense stockpile in the US, have some sort of buffer room. But the auto industry doesn't have that oftentimes. So what this means is when there's a disruption of supply, we generally would prioritize it to defense uses before it goes to civilian uses. So it could be a major disruptor of manufacturing, particularly electric vehicles. Last year was a record year for EV sales, but there's kind of the writing on the wall that we may have some really critical disruptions to being able to sustain that industry.
So what's the economic fallout if we can't, this seems absolutely catastrophic for the United States.
really significant fallout because we don't have an alternate supplier. I was on the phone earlier with MP Materials, which is our U.S. rare earth company. And at the end of the day, they don't have the separation capabilities here at home. So what they are pulling out of the ground now is essentially getting stockpiled. But until I separate it, I can't use it, which means that because of that mid-tier disruption, every industry, whether it's semiconductors, cars, or defense technologies, stands vulnerable to disruption.
So I think Americans are going to need to learn a lot more about these things that we, I guess, took for granted. But I have to ask you, why is China choosing to stop the export of these items essentially across the board rather than target the United States directly?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think there's a few things that are happening here. Is right now they're issuing licenses, which means that we don't know who they're going to give those licenses to.
Right.
Right. So at the end of the day, it's possible that there's very few licenses given to the U.S., but countries that are willing to continue fostering stronger collaborations with China are not impacted by these restrictions. So it's likely going to be far more targeted, given that it was in retaliation to President Trump's new tariffs.
So, Grayson, I want to ask you, let's go back to the military for a second. These rare earth metals are used in drones, robotics, spacecraft, missiles. How do we, obviously we have some stockpiles and we can keep going, but if this situation doesn't change, what happens to our military base when it comes to these really critical technologies that we're making use of?
Our domestic industrial base is going to be deeply affected. I mean, back in 2023, actually, there was a report put out by the China Select Committee specifically looking at, and there was part on rare earths. And it noted that we really needed to roll out all of the incentive possible to build the mine to market or mine to magnet supply chain for rare earths. And what we've seen again is that we haven't quite done it. But I want to walk you back one step. People keep asking me, did we know this was coming?
Right.
Rare earths were actually the very first mineral that China weaponized in modern times. So back in 2010, China and Japan got into a fishing trawler dispute, right? And what did they do? They cut off exports to Japan of these rare earths. Now, fast forward to 2023. In December, China actually put out a ban on exporting rare earth processing and separation technology. And like I told you, remember that they separate about 100% of the heavy rare earths now. Is it for a lot of Western countries, Australia, America, we actually realized we didn't even develop the technical know-how to be able to do this. So that meant we move much slower because we don't know how to do it. And then over the last 5 years, we've spent several $100 million through the Defense Production Act to build these capabilities. But like I always say, mining is a long-term industry. We can't bring these capabilities online overnight.
So why didn't we have these capabilities to begin with? It feels like, we knew something was coming, certainly with the Trump administration, and we had a preview of this in the first Trump administration, that there was going to be some kind of tariff showdown with China. I don't think anybody could have predicted it would be this much of a showdown. But why haven't we developed this capacity here in the United States and able to be self-reliant in this field?
This feels like such a common sense question to you, me, and probably many of our listeners of we've known restrictions were ramping up, they hold the supply chain. There's not really a great answer to that, is we actually just didn't do anything. Inaction was a course of action we charted for a long time. One of our American rare earth producers this morning said it was really going to take a national emergency before we really created a stronger strategy of what we need to do here. So even though we have issued some of these awards out in the last 5 years, we haven't taken the concerted action that we need. And now we're really feeling the consequences of that. And
do you see a scenario where the United States does need to develop its own capacity at an accelerated rate now?
I think that happened today. When I look at, there's two things that are happening in parallel here in the U.S. now. When a colleague said I'm drinking from the fire hose, I think that was a very real statement. One is, how do we hurry up and build those processing capabilities, right? So we're currently building rare earth separation facilities in Texas and in California. But how do we get these projects to speed? Well, they're still not going to be here tomorrow, but we're going to keep on keeping on with those. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to look for new sources of rare earths. The US government through the DFC actually has part ownership of a rare earths recovery project in South Africa. We're also looking to do debt to a rare earths project that would have some of these heavy rare earths in Brazil called Serra Verde. And the idea or the hope is that for some of these projects, once those midstream facilities are online to process, that they would come back home. Ultimately, the success or failure of the US in this extremely critical supply chain is going to be dependent on whether we can line up that foreign policy to source feedstock with our domestic industrial strategy to bring it home to refine. And at this point, it's more emergent than ever before.
Graceland, it's interesting. Just as we're talking about this, China's President Xi Jinping is traveling to Vietnam and Malaysia, which are two places that are rich in these rare earth deposits. Is that a coincidence?
Unlikely. Vietnam is the second biggest reserves in the world, right? And Vietnam is now going to be at a critical juncture of, do we want to work with the US and potentially be a source of rare earths to the US, or are we going to double down with our neighbor China, right? Malaysia has one of the only separation facilities in the world outside of China. And if they want to work together with China, that's going to further impede our ability to get us an alternate supply. So given that those are two countries that are very strategic to the US and being able to find an alternate supply and in a way circumvent the consequence of some of these restrictions, probably not coincidental, Andrew.
Graceland, the Trump administration has said repeatedly that the American people are going to have to accept a little bit of pain for long-term gain. But it seems like this puts us into a lot of pain. Can you put that in perspective?
It's going to be a lot of pain, and it's going to be long-term pain. So here's what I mean by long-term pain is as these policies and as these restrictions are coming out, most mining companies are finding new off-takers. They're not interested in the on and off restrictions, the on and off tariff, because ultimately they have shareholder returns that they owe, and they need the stability we're not able to give them. An easy example of this, earlier we talked about germanium, which goes into semiconductors. Our biggest source of germanium comes from a company called Teck, which is a Canadian company. They mine it in Alaska, it gets refined in Canada, and then it comes back. But with the tariffs, their CEO has gone public and said, I'm going to send it to Asia. With US tariffs, I'm not interested in the US market. So what that does is China is off the table because they've restricted us. Canada is now not going to be a source. And then what do we have left? Every device that we need a semiconductor for becomes more expensive in the long term because I can't bring another germanium source online quickly. We are creating a long-term distrust in markets that finding off-takers to the US market beyond 6 months or a year is going to get very difficult.
Do you see congressional action coming to try to, sort of support the Trump administration, who's saying one of the big problems we have is we're so reliant on China for things like rare earth minerals, and we need to develop our own capacity. That's a big part of their strategy, it seems, their policy. Do you see support in Congress for this? Is that where this is going? Or is this a situation where the economy is going to really sort this out and people are going to be really upset if they can't get a car because they can't get a magnet for a car?
This is absolutely an area of bipartisan congressional support. I think back to probably a day or two after the election, and a Democratic senator called and he said, I think critical minerals are one of the only areas where we can co-write a bill now. And what we've seen actually is even, preceding these tariffs that are obviously triggering a lot of these actions, is that Republicans and Democrats have released a number of really good bills on financing international cooperation, geological mapping, etc., to bolster supplies of these minerals. Because at the end of the day, one of the things I say often to countries worldwide is one country holding dominance at the level of 90 to 100% is not healthy for the global economy.
And that's where China is. They're 90 to 100% dominant in this space. We're out in the cold, and thus this really threatens us, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And ultimately, it's in China's hands whether they choose to give export licenses out, right? And if they don't, any country is beholden to that. So a globally dispersed supply chain is a healthy one for the global economy. And so there's a lot of bipartisan support to this. I do expect, I was in the White House recently, and someone said, there's 50 critical minerals and 5 more that Trump has added through executive order. How do I prioritize what's important when I have 55 of them?
Well, that's a great question.
It's a great question. And I can tell you the ones where we are highly reliant on China, in the case of rare earths, graphite, a small number of these, where you're in the over 90% range. The ones that are vital for national security are going to be at the top of the list. So with the flurry of bipartisan legislation coming out, it is very likely that they are targeted at rare earths.
So to bring this back home, another big issue with rare earths is, of course, semiconductors. We need semiconductors for everything from washing machines to computers to military technology. How does that factor into this?
Semiconductors are absolutely crucial. Not as a matter of just defense or economic security. They are cross-cutting in every way. And a lot of the export restrictions that have come out in the last 2 years are targeted at semiconductors, right? Germanium and gallium, very, very crucial. Gallium, we don't even produce in the United States, right? That was a targeted restriction at the United States. Rare earths, super important. Ultimately, I think, what's going to be really interesting to see is how the U.S. prioritizes a limited supply of materials. So if you have X amount of rare earths, obviously, generally our military technologies will take first priority order in meeting supply. Then we're going to have things like semiconductors and energy. But given that rare earths are one of the few minerals that I use in everything, there's going to be fierce competition for limited supply.
So, this brings me back to the, U.S. auto manufacturers. You're from Detroit. The big 3 are really important to our economy. They're really important to our national psychology. They're just really super important, especially since there's going to be big tariffs on cars from other countries now. We need American cars to be rolling out as efficiently as possible. What do you think this does to that?
The auto industry has been hurting for kind of in back-to-back punches from policy. The day that Liberation Day, Stellantis had already, I think announced it was 900 layoffs in the Midwest, which really hurts. Is when you add up the kind of current state of policy between tariffs and export restrictions, these goods, reciprocal tariffs from other countries, making them more expensive to export, the auto industry is really hurting. And remember, EVs are already more expensive, right? I think about the fact that the average EV is $55,000 and you have a much smaller used car market. You think about the fact that your conventional gasoline vehicle is about $44,000. I don't know about you, but a lot of households in America are also very worried, right? The Inflation Reduction Act, which gave you that $7,500 tax credit for the EV, is paused. I'm not sure if I'm what the future job market is across the country. I've had many people say, I know so-and-so in manufacturing in Utah, they're worried about their job. So we have a supply and a demand crunch, right? Where the potential demand for these vehicles is really weakening as the economy starts to hit, gray skies. And then you have really critical supply side barriers as well, as it relates to these minerals. So the auto industry is really in a tight spot right now, and figuring out how to support them should be a bipartisan priority. I lived in Michigan in 2007, 2008 when the auto industry collapsed. And I can tell you that there were kids in high school that were as smart as me sitting in calculus who didn't get to go to college because one of their parents were ultimately employed, or both, in the auto manufacturing industry. I lived 5 minutes from a Ford plant, 5 minutes from a GM plant. This ultimately has generational consequences, and I see that for Michigan. So, these policies are really going to be tough for our auto industry.
Tough to swallow. Gracelyn, as always, so insightful on an issue that a lot of us don't know a lot about. Really, really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.